Hi, and welcome back to the Interpreter Hub podcast. As always, I am Mark Rockford. I'm going to go with the nickname The Curious today because, as you probably figured out, I like to ask lots of questions. And we are super excited to have just an amazing guest with us today. Before I introduce her, I also have the other host, Mateus.
Hello everyone, Mateus here again. Today's a very special day for us here at Interpreter Hub. In our podcast, we have a legendary guest here with us. She will be introducing herself. And guys, pay attention to this episode because this is one of our best episodes so far.
If you don't recognize her, guys, this is Katharine Allen. She has over 3 decades, even though she doesn't look like it, right? She looks like she's turned 21. She has over 3 decades in the interpreting community. She's a huge name. She's been involved in a lot of different movements over those 3 decades, right? So I do want to let her highlight some of what she's done, what she's doing now, and then the whole reason that she's here to speak with us, the Safe AI Initiative.
No pressure. Already one of the best episodes. Appreciate that.
100%.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm excited about this podcast and what you guys are trying to build and the audience you're targeting. So I'm very happy to come in and support as I can. So I'll give you a little bit of a lengthy spiel, and we can touch on some of why I'm here, like what you want to talk to me about. So I have been in this business for a long time. I kind of entered in sideways, as a lot of people in my generation did. You know, I was bilingual. I studied the equivalent of political, like international development. I lived in Chile for a while doing education work, and because I was spoken English and Spanish, I was always getting pulled over to interpret one way or another. When I came back and I moved, one of the very, I have a very eccentric mix of life. I live very rurally in rural California, and I happened to move there at a time when the big immigration wave of the 90s hit. You know, and our little town went from like 5% to 50% Latino in about 10 years. So big change. And I just got pulled in to interpret all the time. And eventually it occurred to me, there could be a career in this, right?
To make some money.
I can make it well, or I can just, I can also, so ultimately I guess I share that because I came out of this as a community interpreter, and I came into the field before the field was really formed. And I was pulled to interpret for special education meetings and for the victim services at the DA's office. And for, I did all of that. I had no idea what I was doing. I had no ethics to follow. I had no framework. I had no colleagues at the time. So when I sort of understood that I wanted to pursue this as a career, I did begin sort of a long process of figuring out where the conferences were, what kind of education could I get. And I joined the American Translators Association and started going to the conferences. And there I met the heads of the newly formed California Healthcare Interpreting Association. It was like 3 years old at that point, and sort of a foundational professional association for medical interpreting. And I started the process of trying to get back to school. So I had about a 10-year period where I both entered into leadership and work and committee work, in the I'm going to really date myself, but we are talking about like the mid 90s onward. It's really when healthcare interpreting in the United States began to form, and I just hit it at that time. And so I ended up coming in as the whole profession was being established. And because I kept raising my hand and saying, sure, I'll be on that committee, I ended up, really getting to see a lot of the formation and be both a community interpreter and then later a trained interpreter and then a trainer as we went along. So I made my way to the Middlebury Institute of International Studies eventually and got my master's in conference interpreting and translation in Spanish and English. And that gave me the foundation to take that knowledge back out and not just continue to interpret, but really I put my sights on training and developing training and kind of that continued advocacy work. So I spent a lot of years teaching myself how to be a trainer and take the lessons from conference interpreting and pull them back out into community interpreting. And in the process,
awesome. Let me jump in there real quick,
pause right there.
Katharine, because for those of you who don't know, the Middlebury Institute, it's one of the few. They're growing. There are more programs now, but like in the United States, there are not a lot of interpreter training program degrees, right? They're rare, few and far between. I think Middlebury was, I don't know if they were the first, but they are definitely one of the most well-known, right? And they are very active in promoting the industry.
Yeah, Middlebury was so what's growing is really the attention to medical and legal and community interpreting. Those programs are growing. The conference interpreting programs are not. They've been retracting, which is unfortunate. But yes, Middlebury sort of was established as a classic conference interpreting MA, and I came in there with like, hi, I do healthcare interpreting. So it was a really.
Did you get any of this?
Oh, well, sure. I mean, that when we came in, at that time, like legal interpreters didn't think medical interpreters, were, serious, and conference interpreters didn't take any of it seriously. It was just a very siloized field in the U.S. Interpreting really specialized before it generalized, and it has yet to generalize, and it's kind of gone backwards, right? So that segues to when I graduated from Middlebury. I partnered with one of the professors there, Barry Slaughter Olson, and we did found an organization called Interpret America. And we spent 10 years just trying to get everybody together and talking to each other. And I do think it's part of my legacy.
Successful.
We were.
Not as successful as you wanted to be, but you were pretty successful.
No, I mean, I feel like we really were, in the sense that it just, people were hungry for it. We hit the right idea at the right time. It wasn't like we didn't do it to make money. It was, it was just to get, it was just to push, just to push the conversation forward. And so we were able to get everybody talking to each other. And some of the, the legacy of that I see today, and like we are standing up some pretty rapid responses to AI, and we're going to get into that, and to some of the things happening in the US right now around language access. And you see these relationships that have built, and I'm certainly not taking credit for all of that, but I was, very, it was a really satisfying time to get people talking to each other and to see, the growing understanding of, hey, we're all the same profession. And,
that's a great segue. Where are you at today? Because you're also now working with another population that has traditionally been looked down upon, that has been, I'm going to say, like pushed to the sidelines and just very highly up. But where are you at today?
Yeah. So in 2022, I took a position at Boostlingo, which is actually software as service technology company. It provides a remote interpreting platform and provides on demand.
Why would you do that? That sounds difficult.
Why would I do that? Yeah. Why would I? I'll give you a little bit of context for me. So probably one of the most amazing things when you come into a profession that doesn't really exist, and then 25 years later, you have somehow the country has founded healthcare interpreting as a really, I mean, it's still young, immature, but it is a recognized, valid profession with, valid certification processes. Like if you had told me it would go that fast, I would have said no way. And you sort of realize what small groups of people working really hard can do in such a huge country, right? The fact that there is a established and acknowledged profession across the country is still kind of mind-blowing to me. But all of that work was done parallel to the internet coming aboard, and then to email, and then, to mobile technologies, right? And so you have a profession that was founded by people who are working on site. And while we're building out all these structures and fighting for quality and, what is competency, and making sure that actually professional interpreters are being hired, the mobile technology is making on-demand telephonic and video interpreting possible. And the people who came on to work on those platforms were just not the same people that were building out the field, who were largely working on site. And it's hugely important work. It set the standards. It set what we understand to be a professional interpreter. But in the meantime, you had companies start selling interpreting as a service in a much more commoditized way. And we didn't really pay attention, I mean, the way I wish we would have, because now we have two very separate workforces. And we have this big remote interpreting workforce, which is now largely not based in the United States. And so when I had the opportunity to go into a company like Boostlingo in a training role to build out sort of a whole training process, I'm looking at the opportunity to bring a lot of expertise and knowledge to a very under-resourced and, underpaid part of our profession, which are remote interpreters, right, who are doing the on-demand services.
Wow,
so for
me,
made
about 1 million fans by saying underpaid. They're going to be like, yes, Katharine Allen, champion, right?
Yeah. Well, it's, there's a reason why you don't have that workforce is not in the US, right? Because the product that's being sold, and my company is part of that, so I'm not throwing it under the bus, because when I came, it's been a long journey with sort of on-site and remote. There's been a lot of that sort of classic, oh no, that's bad, we're good, that can't happen, this is the right way to do it. And anytime a new technology comes in, it threatens the existing structure, and it creates
right?
change. And all we're living through is change. Like, we didn't even have a chance to stand up as a profession before it was getting flipped by technology, and now it's getting flipped again, right? So it's, I say all of this just with like, this is what happened, and I think we've gotten away from the narrative of, there shouldn't be remote interpreting, because that, it's not that all the ways that there are so many issues around when is it best, when is it not, when do you want in person, when does a remote maybe, work better. But I think that many things that people miss, I'll give you one, and I'll pause. You can ask that question. But one of the other thing that's kind of mind blowing to me is that we're 50 states, we're over 350 million people. We have somehow talked the healthcare world into complying with their language access requirements, that they do need to provide a language bridge to anyone who comes in, regardless of their national origin. And the only way you do that is with a combination of on-site and remote. Like, you can't even get close to having those hospitals be in compliance with these regulations without offering them the full scope of access to interpreting services, right? Because
100%.
You are not going to.
Let me dig in here real quick, right?
Like, I'm going to keep interrupting you,
right? So,
I'm not letting you talk at all. Be quiet. I'll be quiet.
That's fine. The audience has heard way more than they need to from me, right? So, I want to dig into that, because I still, at the last conference I went to, which was late last year, I still hear people saying on-site is always better, right? Which I take big issue from. I come from the on-site world, and then I went to a remote company just like you, right? Different name, different company. We're not from the same company, right? And I found that there are so many interpreters doing remote that are just high quality, just an amazing caliber of interpreter. And with the tools available to them, that oftentimes, and this is where I'm going to get reamed, right? But oftentimes they're better than the on-site, right? Not always, right? There are definitely, some on-site that are really good. There are some remote that are really bad, right? And vice versa. But man, the ability to use DeepL, Lingua, or any tools while you're actually interpreting, because I don't know what the current count is, but English has over 650,000 words in it. Spanish, even though it's more regulated with all the dialects and slang, is something similar. I know it's at least a couple 100,000, right? So nobody knows all of those words, right? There's just no way. You can't always get it. So the tech is awesome. So how do you respond to that myth that on-site is always better?
Well, oh boy, that's a deep question. I think first of all, when we get to the safe AI part of this, one of the reasons that has driven a rapid response around AI that we didn't get around remote is that we never responded to remote in any kind of coherent way as a profession. So we don't actually have the research that tells us, what we have tiny little research projects here and there that might talk about remote versus on-site, but we don't actually know. Nobody can actually say based on research, hey, this is when people seem to respond best to this modality over this modality. Here are the criteria to consider when you're, sticking the even to the point of, should you have a TV set in your ER room, or should it be on a, if you're going to talk about remote, should it be on a stand being moved around? Like, we just have so little information to even be able to answer that question. And I think from common sense and from knowledge and expertise, we can say that there are many cases where clearly having somebody on site is going to be ideal, especially if you can provide continuity, or there's something really sensitive about it, or it really helps that they know the interpreter has that context. But I've worked in so many cases, especially with, less languages of lesser diffusion, where if you come from the community and you're on site, it's not, that can be super problematic for that interpreter, depending on what the encounter
100%.
is, right? And so I've trained many interpreters from languages of lesser diffusion who say, yeah, I do the remote work. I get called in for legal cases and medical cases where they want an outsider. They don't, right? I mean, there's just so many different sort of, we're interacting with all the different ways humans interact. So it's infinite.
But I think you hit something
right?
on the head there. It's a study that
Mm.
I've always wanted to see, but it doesn't exist, right? Like you're talking about like linguistically, like what might be more appropriate. But so many
Right.
times I think we live out the sociologically, the psychology, like because you add a third person physically present in the
Right.
interaction, I don't care what the interaction is, and it changes, right? Like it's just that social dynamics change. So I always think of remote interpreting as pure interpreting in my mind because it's just the voice.
Yep.
And it lets the other two people that are physically present in the room. I know this doesn't happen. You guys can tell me like doctors don't pay attention to patients. I know, but the provider has the ability to look at all of the paralanguage that is coming from the patient that has nothing to do with the interpreter, and they should be paying attention to because so much of the impact of your language isn't just the verbal message, right? It's everything else. And when you've seen this, when you throw a live interpreter in the room, oftentimes they're staring at the interpreter the entire time, right?
So
instead of looking at the patient or the doctor, no matter where you position yourself, right? Like I know the triad positioning behind the provider, like none of it's perfect, right? You still are causing some kind of interaction. And I don't even know, like we'd have to get psychologists involved or other people to like look at the effect.
I look at that a little more broadly. Like I think it's to me, it's like every communication has so many layers to it, right? So part of being a professional interpreter is understanding what layers you're navigating in which modality, right? So if you're an on-site interpreter, we have a million different ways to train you to minimize the impact of your physical presence and to make sure your physical presence, doesn't derail the communication. And we have that same need for remote, right? We have the identical need for remote because whereas you might not be making the same impact, that you might not be distracting in a certain way or creating whatever dynamics you're creating just by being there. You are creating a whole bunch of other dynamics by not being there, right?
Well, I don't disagree.
Right.
I got to point something out here.
Yeah. So I think it's a matter of training.
Katharine has said
Uh-huh.
interpreter. She hasn't said interpreter. She said professional interpreter, right? Which I love because it's true. It's like we're like every other industry. We've got professionals and we've got amateurs. Even if you're getting paid for it, you could still be an amateur, right? And you're right. It is training. And it's just a matter of, again, another study that we don't have. How many interpreters out there are trained appropriately for their modality?
Right.
I'm going to guess it's very, right?
Well, I would say
percentage-wise.
I mean, I think in the United States, on site in healthcare, it's high. It's higher, and it's probably high in legal. Pretty high in legal. I know, but we both
the legal. I'd agree with you.
Both
the
workforces are
for medical. It's just so many people thrown in.
Both workforces are very undertrained and under-resourced, right? I mean, that's the other thing that we lose is like we have a really young profession that we hacked into existence on 40 hours base. I mean, I do know why that got embedded in, but it's sort of absurd. It's like we give you an orientation and we test your proficiency and off you go, and so everybody is so self-trained, and then if you get down into the educational interpreting, you have an even bigger workforce with less professional resources. And then you move on to the remote, right? So, but listen, I'm going to pause here for a minute because Mateus, you must have a question.
Yeah, I was actually going to ask him to segue us into what we're here to really discuss about, which because we could go on all day.
Talk about we're going on,
which is AI. So Mateus.
I'm a remote interpreter based in Brazil now. So we want to hear from you. What is your perspective about AI? How do you see AI impacting remote interpreting, but more specifically OPI and VRI interpreting for us international interpreters? So
yours sounds a little low, just so you know, but I think I did. But so how is it impacting remote interpreting, especially internationally and OPI? Is that's the core question, correct?
Yes, exactly. Is the audio better now?
Yeah.
All right.
Current state.
I think there's two ways it's going to impact it. I mean, I think there's various ways, but one will be monitoring how much there is replacement that comes in for existing work. And, if you're servicing the U.S. market, which is the largest, I think, OPI market, all of that has become even more uncertain kind of with what's happening in the U.S. around a lot of policy, because, it's the established sort of ways things are being done. There's a lot of disruption, as people know, just in terms of how services are being provided, what's being funded, what's not being funded. So I would say that there's already pressure and a lot of companies trying to sell replacement AI. And I'll let
Sorry, Matthias, I'm going to mute you.
There you go. It's trying to give yeah. So there's already, there we go. We'll just let it, we'll solve the tech problem. This is part of it, right? Yeah. So I think that there's one end is just that replacement side, where their companies are coming in and promising the unicorn and the moon. Like, hey, there are companies in the United States selling fully compliant replaceable healthcare interpreters right now that are all AI. And the claims are, they're just sort of absurd, because AI cannot be an ethically compliant interpreter. And that's what they promise. Like, hey, we comply with the NCIC code of ethics. It's like, okay, so you can intervene and you can observe and you can do all this stuff. So the claims are sort of silly, but they're slick, and the demos and the tools look really good. Like, hey, you can just have this conversation and no problem. You don't need that interpreter. The protection against that really embedding fast for the U.S. market are all the language access laws and the regulated spaces that do action. Well, just let it go. That do actually say this is what a qualified interpreter is, and this is what their skill set has to be. And so the AI does not have that skill set, right? And especially not in all the languages. And you have that in education, and you have that in legal, and you have it, anywhere you've got federal funding with the civil rights laws that are, in place currently. So I think that's one way that you have to kind of look at it, right? I think the other thing,
you said replacement. So where do you see it? Do you see it doing any replacement currently? I'm thinking for that admin work, whether it's scheduling an appointment or, something that's incredibly basic.
Yeah. I see, and I don't see that as, to me, I probably would qualify that more as expansion, a little bit of replacement, but more as expansion. I think you're looking at models that will mimic like a customer service model, where if you're trying, you start with the airline and you start on their website with their chatbot, right? And you're talking to AI, and then they solve the problem, and then maybe they get you to a human person on the chatbot, and then maybe ultimately they give you a phone number to call and talk with the human being directly. And I think that that's the most likely models we're looking at. So you're looking at like a gray area where maybe some interpreting needs to do scheduling, and you get called in and do that. But I could see that definitely getting replaced, more by the AI bot. But you've got a continuum of, okay, so now when do you switch over to the human? And I think that's where our profession has to be very proactive to defining that moment. Like, here's where it's going to expand access. Here's where you're going to be able to double check information, make calls, have contacts with these patients that get lost in the shuffle because there aren't interpreters doing that, where there is contact for an English speaking patient. And then does your healthcare provider know, stop, roll over to a human interpreter, right? So I think that's the work in front of us on that end with AI.
Awesome. Well, okay. Tell us then about who's in the Safe AI community, right? In this, I'm sure there are. I'll go to the website and check out like your future goals and whatnot. How are you going to get like stakeholders involved? Okay, let's just start. Who's involved currently?
So let me say one more thing about the last question, then I'll segue into Safe AI, because we are definitely just going to continue to see a lot of improvements with speech to speech, where you have avatars who it's going to be harder to tell if it's a human or not. So one of the big issues is, okay, how are we going to tell even, especially if it's just OPI? And then the other thing I think we're going to see is expansion out. I think we're going to see that dialogic AI, which still has a long ways to go, right? capture, who's speaking, what language are they speaking in, how fast can it go back and forth, is it going to capture all the layers? But there's a lot of use cases where interpreting currently isn't even sold, that I can see that moving it onto business use cases, more concrete tourism use cases, lots of use cases, where they're not paying for interpreting at this point, right?
Honestly, thinking about it, it's all economics, right? It's going to come down to supply, demand, and whatnot. And I feel like there's still a shortage of professional interpreters out there. So this might actually give us room for expansion. What do I mean? So if you start off with an AI interpreter that's easy to use, quick to connect to, right? Really good for getting that appointment. And then the LEP is always like, I have a question.
Yes.
Right. And you're like, oh, hold on. Live interpreter. Let me queue them up. Right. And then you go to the live interpreter for whatever. The adoption rate could actually be driven up if AI is done well.
Yes.
And then I'm just, again, thinking out loud. Again, I don't have an LSP, no connection to the LSPs, but I want to say the financial incentive would seem to be there to be able to upcharge for a live interpreter compared to an AI interpreter, right? Because you're going to be able to say all of those things are culturally appropriate. They are ethically driven. They are hopefully quality trained, right? They are a professional live interpreter. And I think those three words will really mean something to clients that are looking for the absolute best service.
And that is the education that is in front of us. And that's a huge concern for me, is that need for, we have it in the remote side of the industry and the profession, companies are selling, there's just, the competition is to sell a magic unicorn service. We can do 24/7, all 300 languages, no problem. There's no difference in that sourcing that. And the back end of that is everybody's, scrambling even for Spanish because there's so much demand for it. But then, the scramble for ASL interpreters right now, for example, and the scramble
that's been going on for years, right?
And there's no easy solution to it, right? So one, I personally feel like we need to stop selling that magic unicorn and get a little more nuanced and engage and partner with our clients and say, here's what the AI can and can't do. Here's what we can and can't do around these language, these different language pairs. But the other, I do want to answer the last bit, because I know for the remote interpreters who may be listening to this, you are at the long tail end of the AI conversation right now. It's probably impacted you the least, and you may also be the interpreters who are least paying attention to it in your work site. And that would be one of my strongest messages today, is that is what I would most like to see flip. Everybody needs to start playing with these tools, using these tools, understanding these tools, because they are going to come into your workplace. And I think one of the ways that it could come in soonest would be transcriptions on the screen of the conversations you're having. I think that's likely to come in. I think that has huge implications for our profession around training and the skill set and the expertise. Because if you aren't, are you just going to then read and trust the transcript of what was just heard, and it becomes kind of a, site translation, and you're just reading off a screen? There's a lot of implications that are coming down the pike with that kind of support. It could be tremendously supportive, especially with, we've already seen really supportive technologies and simultaneous, that will pull, any number or any you can train it to glossaries, any number, any acronym gets highlighted, it shines out in a different light, and you can see it and grab it and say it correctly. So it has a lot of potentially harmful connotations for the skill set, I think, but also some potentially amazingly supportive connotations. And it really is going to be on us to channel that and try and control for it. So in terms of the broader,
right. I love analogies. So
Yeah.
To me, AI is like a calculator. Yes, I can do long division in my head or on paper if I have to, but why would I?
Right.
It's faster and more accurate if I use the appropriate tool. Calculator can't do it by itself. I've never seen a calculator multiply or divide without input, right? And so same thing. I don't think that we're going to see an interpreter in 5 years that's at the top of the pile that doesn't use these tools, right?
Right.
Will there be interpreters that don't? Yeah, but you're going to get left behind, right? Just like in anything else.
Right. We have to stay on top of these technological changes. And then the other thing I'd say that I'm hoping that we see come in, and this is why I want to, I've been working on a lot of trainings at conferences to start figuring out how to train to this stuff, but if you are not using AI right now as an interpreter to prep and create glossaries and to do simulations of what you may, if you go in as a remote interpreter and you're Achilles heel is, a financial call. If you aren't already using these tools to create scenarios and targeted glossaries, then to me, it's like you're already using long form and not the calculator. The calculator for that is amazing. Like it's a game changer for us on that end. So I'm hoping we're going to see like the ability to do automated glossaries. You drop it in a remote call and and whether they tell you or you get a little thing saying this is for a knee surgery or a diabetic, whatever it might be, that you can quickly type in a prompt and say, I need, what's likely to be talked about in this session, and you can get an immediate support on it, right?
Yeah, I'm gonna plug Matthias there because we've already
I think
created.
I'm back now. Just to double check, can you hear me okay now? Yeah,
much
Riverside
better.
didn't want me here apparently because the topic is AI, so Riverside decided to not let me talk.
It's because Matthias isn't alive. Matthias is an AI. No. But I was going to plug Matthias because we've done the tech guide for the Interpreter Hub to help with little things, getting ready for this, right? But we're looking at doing AI trainings, right? For exactly this reason, because people are scared. They want somebody to hold their hand. They want people to show them how to use what's new and different, right? And that's what a community is about, right? So, I don't know if there's any good trainings out there. If there are, awesome. But we will have trainings for like how to make these uses. I mean, because you spoke excellently of use cases, right? That anybody can do right now, even with some of the free models, right? It's limited, but you could use the free models. Or if you want to pay for it, I think it's $20 a month for that BTC. So, can they drop that one? There's good stuff out there, right? So back to the Safe AI committee, who are currently the stakeholders?
So I will tell you, so Safe AI is a group of originally 11 people who saw when ChatGPT launched in 2022, correct? 2022, 2020, end of 2020.
Yeah.
So fall of 2022, it was like, for me, it was like that immediate, like, okay, we're going to get rolled if we don't have a response. This is going to come on faster than mobile technology, faster than any of the other changes. And there were sort of about 11 of us with a lot of experience in the industry and the profession said, okay, we got to stand something up. So we stood up the Safe AI and Interpreting Task Force. And our initial immediate goal was we stood it up in mid-year 2023 and was like, by the end of the year, we want to have a big research study done. We want to get a lay of the land. We want to get a, screenshot of what's going on so that we can then know how to begin to respond. And so we had 600 people respond to that call to action. And so we kind of built up an organizational structure to allow for that initial work. And we did publish, a big perception study that came out, in early 2024. And then based on that, and it was run by CSA Research, which is a market research, that does market research in the language services industry. We raised money for it. And so the stakeholders are like practitioners, they're company owners, they're people in different, sort of the lawyers and the advocacy groups, people like and also the professional associations and the certification associations. We had a lot of sort of interest from all over the world, but the majority has been in the United States, and the effort has been mostly in to target right now.
Is there still the opportunity for our audience to get involved?
Yes.
Right. So the remote interpreters that are at home working by themselves from whatever their home country is.
I think the best way to get involved. Yeah. So to finish sort of the structure. So we published the survey, and then off of that we created a guidance that so it comes out with like 4 main principles for what the idea is to provide some guardrails and guidance around how this gets applied. And we, along with the rest of the world, I have to say gratifyingly, have worked really hard and fast on these responses. So you can just say even around the world, people have targeted data privacy, transparency, agency, and ownership. Does the tool improve the outcome for the person receiving it? Or is it, you're right, so it's not exploitive. So there's some like core principles that are have been adopted kind of across the board. In some cases, it's legislation, like in the EU. And we briefly had our Biden executive order, but that was overturned. So it's definitely a lot of churn in the US. But so we provided guidance because we wanted something specifically for interpreting, because we knew there would not be, and if we didn't do it, no one would. So, and then now, the CSA Research came out with like a guidance tool in the fall. And now the two big things we're working on for this year, and especially in the first half, is one, we've been very successful in doing a lot of presentations like this. We have given dozens and dozens of presentations on safe AI and interpreting and what to consider when you start to integrate and adopt AI in interpreting. And we've done it into the federal government. We've done it for practitioners. We've done it for end users. We've done it and like for this podcast. And that's one thing we're continuing. And then the other thing we're working on right now is a much more detailed and usable tool. So I'm in a school district. I have an RFP. How do I vet these vendors? What's the checklist I should have for these vendors if I'm in a hospital or if I'm a business person? So we're working on taking all of that sort of more abstract guidance and turning it into like an actionable tool for people that they can use to say, hey, we're going to sell you this perfect chat bot for all of your school communications. And they're going to have a checklist of 20 or 25 questions to say, can your tool do this? How have you tested for that? Show us how to do, so that you as a person who's not an AI expert could actually help your organization in the process of.
There is a lot to unpack there. So let me just take a couple nuggets out of there. One, I think this is like any other technology, guys. Like you can't bury your head in the sand. It's here and it's going to stay here. There's no rolling it back. Because some people are like, oh, it's horrible. It's here. You got to learn to deal with it, right? Yeah. You can use it or you can lose out to it, right? And the people that do use it. The other thing is I like that approach, but I want to make sure I'm clear. You're not telling companies don't use it. You're saying only use it for, these instances if it complies with this checklist, right? Like this is our recommendation.
But not even that specific. I mean, I think because you have to think of the use case. So really it's like it's like determining the criteria on which you're basing your decision and then narrowing that down to how to actually ask questions around that. So for example, one of the greatest examples of that came out already based on the Safe AI guidance was the National Council on Interpreting in Healthcare put out a 3-page tool for like when you're vetting vendors selling AI into healthcare, right? Because in part in reaction to these companies that are promising, that hey, our interpreters are ethical, right? And so it's what we're trying to do is to give people a roadmap that hopefully is broad enough for them to be able to apply to whatever their use case is for interpreting, right? But also narrow enough that like, hey, if they're in a procurement setting or if they're writing an RFP, for example, I don't know if you ever dealt with requests for proposals very much, but this is where, so for the audience, like who's paying for your interpreting services? Well, it often goes all the way back to a request for proposal from a government entity and companies bid for it and they get the contract. And so those requests for proposals are often written by people very unfamiliar with the interpreting field. And they say things, how are you going to show that 100% of your interpreters have national certification, for example? Like they don't understand the qualification process in the field and why certification can't be universal, et cetera, et cetera. So we're trying to create something that can be just very actionable for people because we are definitely entering into the adoption phase, right? Like you're not going to find organizations or agencies, that aren't trying to figure out where AI fits. So we want to help give people a way to integrate it in safely and ethically and with accountability for its use. Like you have to be accountable to what this produces, good or bad, right?
Yeah, 100%. And I mean, I'm going to jump in there again. And Matthias, I'm going to challenge you from your list of questions. If we can do like a fire round for Katharine, or we can do quick question, quick answer. No. Just like, because we'll never get through all our questions.
But I'll do my best.
But I'm going to say, I don't ask something already asked. Maybe you already talked about that the moment I wasn't here. So if the question is, if we're repeating the question, just let me know and I can skip to the next one.
Yeah, go for it.
All right. So first thing, can AI ever match cultural awareness, nuance, and emotional intelligence that a human interpreter bring to the job or not?
Well, I don't see that happening in the near future, right? I mean, because you're talking about that layered communication, right? Like human communication is much more about than the linguistics. And so AI right now is really good at linguistics. It can be trained around cultural terminology and idioms and things like that. But then trying to capture like the sarcasm and the context of the communication and all the other things that human interpreters actually manage when they're transferring the message, I'd say we're pretty far from that. Yeah.
All right, great answer. Next question then. In what interpreting field, medical, legal, conference, which one do you think AI will gain the most traction first?
Well, we already have the answer to that question that's in conference, right? You already have a lot of AI because it works better. If you do one-to-many communication, like I'm giving a speech, and that's ideal for AI, right? To capture and transcribe, and if you're going to add on a speech layer. So you're already seeing many events and conferences are either completely replacing or using it to expand the number of languages that they offer in their events. So it is any RSI company, remote interpret, right? They've got huge AI components already. Yeah. So if you're not aware of that, they've been the most disrupted first.
Well, that's a
100%.
surprise. Yeah, for sure. I'm gonna look more into that. Definitely wasn't something I was thinking about. All right, next question. Okay, this one here is a little tricky, so you can take your time to think about it. Could AI help interpreters earn more by increasing their productivity, or will it simply be used to lower costs for companies, especially for OPI now?
I just think it's going to be a mix, right? I don't think there's going to be a black and white answer to that. I think you're going to have players who come in and try and just replace and lower and replace. I mean, we already have a rates race to the bottom in OPI and VRI, and we have for a long time, right? So there's already, companies that are trying to distinguish on quality and other things, are really fighting hard not to join that race to the bottom. But I think the answer is going to be both. For me, if I'm in your shoes and you're a remote interpreter, if you are any interpreter, diversifying your work sources is probably the best advice, right? Like,
so a company should have multiple clients, is what.
A company should have multiple clients, but the interpreter themselves should have multiple skill sets. Like the skill set that you have that's like gold, and which may actually become more like gold given how hard hit language education is right now, is that the more that you are truly proficient in at least two languages, the more you have that, that incredible gift of like understanding how to transfer meaning across, which is, it's like, this is what the invisible, what makes it's so invisible. Like people just don't understand like what that is. And to me, it's the precious treasure of what we do and that only we can do, right? So the more you can find ways to, hypercharge that skill set with the tools, like anything from becoming a great marketer, like you don't have to worry about that anymore. You really can rely on AI, for example, to on those kinds of things. And then just, I'm not being very coherent because I don't know how it's fully going to play out, but I think diversifying your skill set.
That's amazing. That's something we talk a lot with our audience about. We are always telling them to keep learning more and more skills that communication play an important role since the interpreter is always communicating. So I loved your answer. It was very aligned with the next question I was going to ask. So I'm going to jump that question. Let's go to the next one. I think maybe you already talked about it, but I wanted to hear from you. How do you see AI influencing interpreter training and skill development in the next decade? Because you can use the language model to challenge the interpreter, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think many interpreter trainers in the field are already jumping on these tools and figuring out how to train them. And so you asked earlier, like somebody earlier said, where are there courses like this? Well, if you go to any interpreting conference right now, there's going to be a lot of mini courses and short courses that people are developing. So a lot of development. My biggest hope for the trainers of the world out there is that you are not complacent. Like you should immediately be using this to supercharge your training. You can do so much to improve your ability to really help interpreters practice skills with these tools. And, maybe we can later talk about it a little bit more how, if people don't understand how, but it's like just.
I think this is the answer to your question.
Yeah.
If you're a trainer, this is where you could increase your productivity.
Yeah. Yes.
Fun.
Yeah.
Right. So maybe it took you hours to make the course before that you could now, 10 hours, now you can have 2, right? Because AI is so great at helping brainstorm, throw out taglines, come up with scenarios, material, like so much.
Creating role plays, creating audio files, creating, all those things that were out of your reach as a as a trainer, and reviewing files and getting feedback on files. And I mean, you
Summaries
have to
and
bring
thread.
your expertise is what's overseeing all of that. So when it goes sideways. But yeah, I do have a lot of concern about training, like academic training programs reacting fast enough, but I think that's a concern for AI for everything in education.
That's lots of industries.
Right?
They've
it's
been
like
pretty
we
slow
need
to
to
react.
it's got to be, we can't react slowly. It's got to go fast. Yeah. But yeah, I'd say I see a lot of activity. So this is the time, if you have a chance to, especially if you're a remote interpreter, if you can't go to an on-site conference, if you can get support to go to webinars and to go to, virtual conferences. And I mean, like the Tech for Word conference, is going to be coming up, AI and interpreting. If you sign up for that and you pay attention to it, you can see all those sessions for free in the first 24 hours, right? Huge, tremendous resource.
Like that's what I'll throw it out. There's a lot of AI for speaking, or AI for remote, or AI for copywriters, or AI for so many things that are relevant and adjacent fields that, again, would diversify your skills. But at the end of the day, like, it's the same skill set of using AI to improve whatever you're doing, right? So,
and I know this isn't a rapid fire, but I also know as a trainer that it can feel very overwhelming when you get thrown so many suggestions. So this is my suggestion. Pick one thing that's fun and start. Like, for example, I have a daughter who has transformed. She regularly plans out date nights using AI. She has a conversation. I want to do this. How can I do a fun thing? I live here. This is how much money I can spend. What can I do to have fun? Like, just do something that's completely fun and silly.
You swipe right, Tinder for like the first 30 minutes.
Right. But I mean, it's like, it can feel so intimidating, but actually it's like, just think of it as Google, except that you can talk to it and then ask follow-up questions. And then it will, it's just like it is much more, it's becoming very agentic, like an agent, but
check sources, because they still hallucinate. They're getting better all the time. Right. They're getting better all the time. Like, I can't imagine in the 2 years since Safe AI started, I mean, it's crazy the amount of change in AI itself, right? Like, it just continues to increase. So, I mean, while the general recommendations there, I can't imagine the specifics are even close to what they were.
Right. But just in terms of our listeners, just if you're feeling overwhelmed, just do something fun, right? And then that will get you over the hump, and then you can start trying small steps with your interpreter. It's related to what you do as an interpreter.
Great. 100%. Just get started. Have fun
just
with
get started.
Yeah.
There's no right way to get started. Just do something, right?
That's amazing. Well, those were all my questions regarding AI. Mike, do you have any more questions? I do have one more question here. I don't know if Katharine will feel comfortable answering to that question. Very complex question, but I feel like our audience would love to talk about that topic. And that is, in your perspective, Katharine, why do you think the US rates are higher than international rates? Because we have a lot of discussions in our community, and the interpreters are always questioning, why does interpreting pay more within the United States than it paid to the interpreters abroad, even though the job
I love this question.
Same? Yeah.
Well, we're going to come right back. Hold on. I still have an AI question, right? So let me jump in
I'll give you a chance to think about that.
Yeah. I'm going to give you a thesis, then you can, like, tell me I'm wrong, convince me I'm wrong, right? Like, there are a lot of industries where I am convinced, and I think interpretation is one of them, that AI will eventually replace a significant portion. Not tomorrow, not in 2 years, right? But I think that eventually, for those straightforward encounters, those repetitive encounters, those things that just happen all the time, AI will replace at least some portion of what we do, right? And I think, like, the timeline I put on that in my mind, and again, I'm probably wrong, but in 5 years. What do you think? Like, when do you think the timeline is that, like, it does a good enough job scheduling appointments or just doing the simple stuff? Again, not the nuanced stuff, not the culturally inappropriate, but, maybe it's the 15th, diabetes education class that the person is given, right? And they give it the same way every single time. Maybe it can't handle the questions, but it can definitely handle the repetitive nature of that class, right? So, or if you've dealt with a health insurance sign-up call, right? Some of those can be incredibly repetitive. So, am I wrong? Is it going to replace that?
So if you're providing service into the U.S., into the remote market, your majority is healthcare. And inside that market, you have really big players, hospitals, big HMOs, right? Just big knitted together organizations where you're probably going to see that happen faster, because already if you were to ask AI all the ways AI is already integrated into telehealth, for example, you're going to see a list that's like 40 different kinds of tools long. It's pretty amazing, right? So I think you're going to see where there is technology development, because what you're saying requires technology, right? It doesn't happen overnight. It's like, in order for, right now you've got live interpreting embedded into all different kinds of, other softwares and other, especially for remote interpreters. So I think that's where you would see that shift fastest, because we're just a small field, right? Compared to like all the other big healthcare things, but you see companies putting a lot of money into developing AI infrastructure for doctors. And so you're going to see it quicker there. You're going to see it less quickly, I think, with the smaller clinics, and which is also a big part of the remote interpreting market, smaller clinics, healthcare, ophthalmologists, dentists, you name it, like all the providers that need to provide interpreting and scheduling and all the, and insurance help on the back end, right? I would imagine that would go a little more slowly, because that requires vetting a new software tool, paying for a new software. It's like it all for those organizations. It's overwhelming too.
That
right?
And so yeah. I will say, even though I'm like sounding doomy and gloomy, like the industry is not ending, Chicken Little, right? The sky is not falling, and there's still, I'm going to say, juice worth the squeeze, right? Like, so I'm not encouraging anybody to leave the industry now, right?
No,
like, there's still a lot of money to be made here, providing services, and a lot of people to be helped here, providing live professional interpreters. Right. So I don't want to sound like, oh, guys, run away. That's not what I'm trying to do at all. But like, be aware that like every other industry, life cycles, right? And eventually some of your simpler encounters will no longer be there. Hopefully, like we said earlier, like that'll be actually drive adoption, because those simple encounters will need the live interpreter to take over. Right. So this could be a revolution where instead of being replaced, we are actually grown, right? We are expanded.
And you see that's what happens. Like, if you think about what happened when machine translation came in, right? So same kind of conversation. Oh my God, what's going to wipe out translators? It didn't. But what it did do was it diversified it grew the industry hugely. Hugely, it grew it. It did, make some of the live human translation work less interesting, and you definitely had kind of because the way the job shifted, but it also created many more jobs that never existed before. And that's the thing to remember. It's like the job descriptions that we have in our profession right now, in 5 years there'll be a whole bunch of new job descriptions we've never even thought about. And that's why this messaging from you and from me around diversification and staying on top of things and finding a way to stay informed and to take opportunities is because that's where your linguistic skills are going to go. Like, your linguistic skills are going to be needed. Your interpreting skills are going to be needed. But that's what nobody can see yet, because it's happening so fast.
We're not clairvoyant or psychic.
And it's hard. Gone are the day. I am of a generation. I grew up before the internet. So I'm one of the last generations that before any of it, right? I'm going to date myself horribly if I tell you all the things, the technology we used when I was a kid, right? And so it's exhausting, because I'm like, you grew up with the idea that, oh, well, things will basically stay the same for the course of your lifetime. But for the last 40 years, nothing has stayed the same. And that's just life. So you build that into your perspective. Like, there is no, I do this job, I'm going to do for 20 years. It's not going to change. That doesn't matter what you do. That's not real anymore.
So we have a link for Katharine's therapy sessions. She'll make you feel better. We can put that into the
yeah. I know. Well, as a trainer, it's like, I just, like, you asked me before we came on this podcast, like, what still drives me 30 years, and what drives me is that bridge that we provide. Like, what drives me is there is nothing like, we all know the difference between being a bilingual, quote unquote, versus being a trained interpreter. Like, that ability to honor someone's voice, whether it's an angry voice, a sad voice, a happy voice, that, whatever it is, and to help that person get that across into another language from somebody from a different culture is unique and precious. And, and I watch, especially for remote interpreters, my distress around the remote interpreting workforce is unbelievably complicated work you are being asked to do, dropping in with no context, no prep time, no nothing. It's like, to me, it's magical what remote interpreters do. I don't know how you do it as someone who came in through the on-site world. It's like, I don't know how. I mean, I know you do it, and I train to it as well, but it still is sort of miraculous to me that people, right? So that's what keeps my passion going. Like, that gift is such a human. It's so core to like human connection and human need, and so that's what
I want
keeps
to
me
jump back into Mateus's question, and then I have a final question at the end. But why do you think the rates are so different in our industry, domestically versus abroad?
I think the easiest answer is macroeconomics for that. Think about the customer service and the workforces that support a lot of industry in the United States. For better or worse, it's the economic behemoth, and so we kind of get to, it's just been dictated. So I think about companies that have, many language service companies, for example, have offices in Argentina and have offices in Manila and have offices in Europe. And I guarantee you that offices in Argentina are also paid less, right? Like the actual language service, provider, not the practitioners. The people who provide operational support for so many software companies that are in the Philippines or in India, and they're getting paid, hopefully, according to the economies of their countries, right? So
we like to believe that we're unique in the language industry, but we're not. Like,
we're not. No, but I do feel like that what's different about the language company, which puts more stress on this, is that nobody in the United States gets paid by the minute. On-site interpreters, there is not an on-site interpreter in existence that gets paid by the minute. Everyone is paid by the hour or half day or full day, right? So you don't even as an on-site interpreter or as a U.S. based like scheduled VRI interpreter, I'm never going to take a per minute rate ever. My rate is minimum 2 hours.
There are domestic remote interpreters who do get paid by the minute, like for the on-demand, right? For Spanish.
If
I know some other languages.
Yes,
but
if you're working on demand. But if you're working on site, you're not. You're getting the pay model is per hour, right? Per hour or per half day or per. I mean, there's usually like driving and all the rest of it put into it. So part of it too is just the structure. So this is what I mean, that we were asleep at the wheel when we were building out this profession, and we allowed the software companies that created OPI VRI putting up pools of interpreters. We really got commoditized, right? Like that per minute model. Like we can,
I wouldn't disagree, but I would even challenge though, like, because if you look at on-site from different regions in the United States, I mean, they're paid different hourly rates. There are different, some places have a 2-hour minimum, some places have a 3-hour minimum, some places have a 1-hour minimum.
Right.
Right.
But they're going to be paid minimum wage in the US, and even that is going to be higher. Right. I mean, they're going to be paid. I'm just saying to you, why is it? It's like macroeconomics, but I think that this workforce is even more, it is a little bit more stressed and pressured, because I don't think all offshored, but I don't really like that term, but workforces, it's like usually you get paid according to the economy of where you live, right? And then of course, then is how low, and I mean, it can be both generous or it can be quite egregiously
100%,
low.
Yeah,
for sure.
Yeah. And then the question is, the argument even inside the US is, don't accept wages below X. There's always this like pressure among interpreters not to accept wages that are too low. But of course, that's just not a real choice for a lot of people.
Exactly.
So,
and what's good for you might be really bad for somebody else, right?
Yeah.
Or vice versa, right? So,
right.
I mean, 100% agree. And like, just to give a little bit more economic background, yes, the language service companies are bidding, as we mentioned earlier, on these contracts,
Yeah.
right? So there's pressure because of competition.
Yeah.
Like the hospital always rates price as one of the major factors.
Right. That's
always, right? So they'll have price, quality, and a couple other things in there. But at the end of the day, right, it's like anything else. I like to speak in terms of like fast food restaurants that we're all familiar with. Like a hamburger somewhere costs one rate, and interpreting is not a hamburger. I understand, but so we can all like be on the same page. Like Burger King and McDonald's have to take each other into consideration telling you they're hamburgers because they're competitors, right? And you don't want to be a Burger King or McDonald's interpreting. You want to be, I don't know, what's Fuddruckers or what's a better burger. right?
Yeah. And it's a long chain too, because other people will say, well, the hospital's paying, so the hospital pays, whatever it pays, per minute, quote unquote, or even per hour. And then by the time you get through all the providers, you've layered through maybe an LSP in the US that's then partnering with a language service provider in Latin America, who's then partnering with a BPO or a recruiter as well. So you get, and this, is it fair to the interpreters? No. And it's like any other labor issue. Like at some point, laborers have to decide if they can get a voice.
Knowledge.
And
knowledge is power.
And so it's, there's lots of, for example, in some of the states in the US, you do have interpreter unions, and in California, interpreter unions, and in Washington State and in Oregon have, managed to up their hourly wages because they fight for it. So it's like, it is macroeconomics. To me,
100%. And if you can cut out the middlemen, if you can be a direct to the domestic, language service provider, you'll probably get a higher rate than if you work for the BPO or otherwise, right? Which people don't even know that these things exist. And then you mentioned earlier, diversify your skills, diversify your clients, and be willing to make the change. Because if you're complaining your rates are low, but you're not willing to go out and look for other clients or work for getting better rates with other clients, then, there's not much anybody can do, because the incentive is not there for language service providers to automatically pay you more, for hospitals to automatically pay you more, health automatically more, right?
And I think another way to look at that too, to kind of try and empower if possible, like it's very easy to think about the they that are doing this to me, or the they that are doing this, right? And really the responsibility, I think, in any workforce, like the more you understand the structure of the industry you're in, that the more you are empowered to understand what's happening, why you get paid what you get, what is the relationships. And that was what going to conferences, especially in the beginning part of my career, really taught me. The eye-opening for me, like, how is this industry structured? Where is the money coming from? Who's actually paying for it? Like at the end of that long tail, could potentially be a grant from the federal government. It could be state funding. It could be coming off of a law in Minnesota. And that's why you're getting this work in El Salvador, right? And so it's like understanding that, I think, is a more empowering way to approach it, and sort of understanding, like, because then you can understand the channels you want to get into. Oh, this is a really low paid channel. This is a better paid channel. This is a better supported channel. I want to get over and work with the companies we do this no matter who you are, what kind of doctor you are, what kind of teacher you are, what kind of mechanic you are. Can you get the, the certification as a Toyota mechanic and get paid better? I don't, it's just, but understanding how it works can take away that kind of frustration and sense of sort of having things happen to you, as opposed to understanding, hey, this is how it's structured. Where do I want to be in this field?
100%. So knowledge is power, and you can make choices if you have more knowledge.
Yes. Yeah.
You talked about being the voice, right? So you have a concept that I found in your blog years ago, and you said you're going to share a story with it. It's called Communicative Autonomy, which means that the person, well, you probably not even know that. What is communicative autonomy? How did it come into place, and why it's important for interpreters?
Okay. All right. Well, the U.S. has some kind of nationally known 40-hour, medical and community interpreting training programs, right? And one of those, which is actually the biggest at this point, is called the Community Interpreter, and it's run through cross-cultural communication. So I became a trainer for this program, and then ultimately, when the training manual, this company actually was updating this every 2 to 3 years, as you should, I got pulled in to be a co-author for the 5th edition of this book, and we turned it into a textbook, the Community Interpreter International. And I give you that background because we became a writing, with an author group of writers, and one of the co-writers on that textbook, her name is Sofia Garcia Bayert. She's from Spain, but she worked in the U.S. for a long time. And we were trying to work on this idea of, how can you empower interpreters to get out of the way as much as you can, so that the people are having you're using all your linguistic skills and your observational skills, but what can you do to actually make sure that the autonomy, the power, the person in control of this conversation are the people speaking and not the interpreter? And there's a million different ways interpreters, in both aware and in unaware ways, we can intercede and interfere in that by bringing in our own bias, all of those things, right? And so, these are all ideas that we were being taught, and it had different names and whatnot. And Sophia was tasked with the chapter on the standards of practice and how to apply the standards of practice for the code of ethics. And she comes to the group at one point with this, 2 or 3 pages outlining this concept, communicative autonomy, which was just basically this thread through concept of like, no matter what we're doing, how can we be using our accuracy, our interventions, our, all the different protocols, our linguistic skills to really make sure that we are keeping the power of conversation in the hands of the people who are having the conversation, and we're not part of that conversation, right? And so that's where
let me interject. That is awesome.
Yeah.
Let me make
that's
it
where
simple,
the concept came from,
right?
Yeah.
Like if the patient says, "Damn, that hurt," right? We're going to interpret that the way they said it, tone, language, everything, right? As opposed to saying, "I don't use swear words, so I'm not going to say that." Right.
But it's not just that. We're not going to do, "Damn, that hurts." Like we're not going to get embarrassed. We're not going to giggle. We're not going to turn away. We're not going to have a frown on our face, because we don't approve.
Deliver
we're not
the
going
message like it's given to you.
Yeah.
100%.
So that's a really simple example, and more complicated examples are, how you might, especially in healthcare, if you're going to intervene because the communication is a train wreck and you think why, how you do that, that you point to it as the interpreter. There may be a cultural misunderstanding here, as opposed to saying, "Hey, they don't understand because XYZ," and so, this is where our field is still young and immature, and like really upskilling people with those intervention skills. And so communicative autonomy was such a brilliant concept, and it's kind of a academic term, but if you think about it, you're just giving the communication power, you're keeping it where it belongs. Doesn't mean, and it's a very, very mindful and active act as an interpreter that you have to do to make that possible. It's just so much more. So you asked, can we go back to that question? When will AI be able to culturally, capture, like, well, maybe never, because does AI, let's make that question. Does AI make communicative autonomy possible? Does it?
Yeah,
right.
We've seen some really good programs, but they can't get tone of voice. They can't get sarcasm. They can't keep all of the pieces of the message that you're putting into it that aren't just the words, right?
And sometimes communication is straightforward, and that's fine, and that's where it does best, right? And then the less straightforward it gets, the more challenged it gets, right? That's if we bring this all the way back around to safe AI, that's what we're trying to protect for, right? That we're trying to help get that word out, do the education. It's like, hey, these tools are incredibly powerful. They are going to expand your ability to communicate across languages, but you got to have these guardrails in place. You have to have this, this awareness in place of, you don't want it to kill people. You don't want to lose money because of it. You don't want to ruin your product because of it. You don't want to,
you got to keep your bias out of it too. Can you imagine? Because the AI can be biased, right? If you program it to have whatever type of discrimination, bias, for, against, etc., like you have to be
I'll give you one
careful.
more example, because I know we need to wrap up, but I'll give you an example of another thing that really made me understand why AI is weak in other language, can be so weak in other languages. And one was, if you take Swahili, which is an African language from Kenya, right? And if you think about, if you go online and you're trying to train a model with the Swahili online, well, a lot of the Swahili that's online was translated from English. So it's not actually native Swahili. And that was what helped me finally, that was kind of when my brain went, oh, I'm starting to get this. It's like, first of all, there's not nearly as much Swahili on the internet available for training, but a lot of the Swahili that's on the internet has already been translated by machine translation, into Swahili from English and other languages. So you don't even know if that Swahili is any good. And so by the time you then turn it into this AI tool, it can shatter in so many ways, right? You
100%.
don't have
There's
right.
just not
and so
the corpus of knowledge. I've done a lot of interviews with indigenous languages and asked them, where's your dictionary? It doesn't exist, right? Oftentimes there is no medical dictionary in whatever the language of lesser diffusion happens to be. So what do you train AI on if there's nothing there, right? Maybe someday when it listens to all the audio and can transcribe it, but I can't imagine the process.
But that's why it gives you, yeah. So that's why it's like, hey, you know, we're talking to probably a largely Spanish speaking audience here, but like it's, hey, you know, the tools are, like we said, I mean, I guess I would just, if I were going to wrap up, I just say, pay attention. You know, this is a nuanced, disruptive, changing time, and just it's really about kind of riding it, right? It's we want to have some paddles in our boat. We don't want to just be in the boat being buffeted around.
100%. That was
paddles.
exactly the analogy I was going to go with. AI can be your paddle, or it can be the ocean, or it can be both.
Exactly.
You can decide, right?
Yeah.
So that is great.
And then for your listeners, Safe AI IT, so the Safe AI Interpreting Task Force, safeAIIT.org is the website. And if you go there, you asked how people could be involved. I would say right now, if you're on LinkedIn, just go follow the group because we post a lot. Go sign up at the website, and then when the calls for action come out, you'll get it.
That would be incredibly helpful, guys, to everyone that's listening, because you are literally the boots on the ground, right?
Yeah.
And everybody's in a different country. You know what's happening, right? And even though your end client is in the U.S. in the majority of cases, you know, you will see how the technology is available and can be adopted not only in the profession, but within your home country to help you with whatever, whether it's prep, whether it's your date night, whether it's directions to, you know, your favorite restaurant or finding new restaurants. Like there's so much. And the more you use it for daily stuff, the more comfortable you use it for professional stuff. So I would give you that call to action. If you've watched any of our stuff on LinkedIn recently, like I echoed, or actually Katharine's echoing me today, not taking it anymore.
That's
like,
right.
It's just get started.
Clearly.
Just get started.
Yeah.
Right. Take an action, whatever it happens to be. So please do that. Katharine, how are you using? You told us your daughter, but how are you using AI?
How am I using? Boy, I use AI. So part of what my job is, it's not just for the training. It's also to like bring industry knowledge into the company. And so I will use AI a lot. Some of the AI are really good at like they have real-time access to the internet. So I don't use ChatGPT. Actually, I pay for Perplexity and Claude and Gemini. Those are the Gemini because of the notebook LLM from Gemini. Those are the three I'm paying for right now, but I also jump around and try them out a lot. So I use it a lot for synthesis. So one of the great things you can do is just vomit out a long prompt and say, I need a good like 1-pager summary of these things going on that include XYZ, 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 you know, look at today's recent events or whatever, you know, and give me that summary. And then so what would have taken you an hour to create just the baseline summary, that happens for you in 30 seconds. And then you can spend your time, you know, correcting it and making sure it's correct and all the rest of it. So I use it a lot just to bring in distilled knowledge. And then I'm using it heavily in course creation because, you know, for example, you know, we just recently been working on some materials for interpreting 911 calls, right? So you can go to an AI and say, you know, tell me how is a 911 operator, you know, give me 4 pages of how a 911 operator is, you know, trained. And then you get this like great distilled knowledge, you know, that's all put together in an organization. And then you can take that and start doing you can create your role plays, you can create your audio files. I mean, on one training recently, I used it to create an audio back and forth. It was all AI, you know, I mean, it's not perfect, but if you have to do things quickly, it's like you have a 3-minute sample OPI call, you know, between, you know, a financial company and an interpreter. And then create the glossaries for that and then create the practice. So I use it. It has boosted my ability to crank out, you know, timely training materials by more than doubled.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I have to throw a warning on there.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Katharine is using this to come up with models that aren't perfect, but it's progress, which is great, and example calls. And she's doing it without uploading real calls because the real calls that you're taking are not your material.
Right.
Do not use them.
No.
Do not record those calls. Don't upload them in AI models. That is not yours. That's private. That's not HIPAA compliant. Don't do that. Right.
Yeah.
Like, because I can just see light bulbs going off of people like, all the material I've got, I'm taking all these calls every day. I can learn from. Yes, you could learn from them, but you can't put them in AI. Right.
Yeah, but you can. but yes. So yes, like nothing proprietary, and don't do, it's like for me, it's like, even when I'm doing stuff, I'll say, I work for an OPI company, right? Like I don't say the name or anything like that, right? And I need information about this. But the nice thing about these skill sets is there is so much to take from the internet on this. So if you say, like one of the best ways you can use it as an interpreter, would be, I frequently have to take these, like, for example, these secret shopper calls, and if you're a healthcare interpreter, that's all online. So you could say, can you give me a 3-minute dialogue of what what's the agent likely to say? What's the, patient likely to say? And it's going to come up with a pretty realistic role play for you that's very, very targeted and way better than going to the CMS website and trying to like imagine that, right?
100%.
So do that too, review it. But then
a lot of the healthcare, health insurance providers they'll have their scripts online, right? Of what they're calling. So they're not proprietary information. They're putting them out there. If you can find them, you can use them, and then you can upload them to use that as the English side, and then have ChatGPT, Claude, Anthropic, Perplexity, Gemini, whatever one you want, doesn't really matter. Imagine the other speaker's side and responses to that, right? So
and you can record, if you need to practice to it, record it yourself, and then just practice to it. I mean, it doesn't, I think one thing as a trainer, people think, oh, if I've already heard it, it doesn't count. No, like put it on repeat and practice it so many times until you've got it memorized. And the next time you have a similar call, guess what? It's going to be,
we can all work with Mrs. Jones and Señorita Martinez, right? Like,
right. Yeah.
Log.
So I think it's just, I use the tools extensively, and I'm constantly trying to kind of understand, how they work and check them, and, but the biggest thing is just being able to have that conversation. Like, no, what you gave me wasn't quite right. That's what's different than Googling it. It's like, no, what I really needed this, or, oh, no, you missed my meaning, or, oh, it helps you clarify your own knowledge and understanding. And of course, you have to understand that you want to be in the boss seat in this interaction and not just take it all like, oh, look what AI said, it must be true. Like, no, you like use your own knowledge. It's going to get things wrong, and then you just tweak it. And the fact that it gets it wrong doesn't mean that it's garbage. It just means that it's scraping from a huge amount of knowledge and trying to decide what it should show to you. And so tell it to show you something else if it doesn't show. So
this has been awesome, Katharine. We really appreciate you having us, coming to speak with us, rather. We'd love to have you guys back in future episodes, right? There's so much more we could discuss, but I'm relieved to know, and I think our audience will be relieved to know, that the industry is not going to fall apart tomorrow.
No, the industry is not. No, the industry is not going to fall apart tomorrow. But you just don't be, in the broader context, it is a very tumultuous time around everything in the U.S. right now, and so just don't, think you may see some things may just kind of be a little. You may see changes in things you don't expect, right? I think it's because when it's not clear how some of these services are coming down the pike. So it's like just stay aware and be good at what you do.
And I mean, to bring this back to pay as well, like you've been in the industry for quite some time, as have I, like these same things in my experience are always a pendulum, right? Like there's a race to the bottom, then quality becomes important and rates go back up, and then again, it goes back down. And those cycles can sometimes take years, but it's not always cheapest, fastest.
Right. Because I think, one thing that one of the biggest protections, and one of the reasons why that has been true, is because of the legislation in the U.S. that requires professional and competent. It has to be. You have to actually be able to interpret and translate to be compliant, and that is the biggest protector. Because when it gets too low, people won't work for it. Ultimately, and then it forces it back up, right? I mean, and so it's not.
The end user complain because it's not. It's not great quality.
Who gets sued if the interpreting, causes death in the hospital? It's the hospital that gets sued. So the hospitals, it's in their own self-interest not to, they want the cheapest price and the best quality. But trust me, inside the company I work for, we see a lot of people coming over. Well, we went with them because they were cheaper, but their interpreter quality was low. Like they didn't have interpreters who were really supported, to be able to do the job. So.
And again, it comes back to knowledge, because so many interpreters, I'm going to say you're not professional yet because you don't know what's out there. You don't know what standards of ethics or codes of conduct. You don't know professionalism. There's just so much that you need to learn, right?
Yeah.
So, well, I told you we were going to end, and then we keep going on forever, but thank you
we
again
could keep
so much.
talking, but it's so
Yes.
nice to talk with you guys. Thank you for having me. I hope we didn't go on too long, but I would love to come back. And you know, I love that you are targeting creating a community and a space for remote interpreters. So you're always going to have my support.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, guys. If you're not subscribed, please do hit that like button and, join the Interpreter Hub newsletter. It comes out multiple times every week now with everything from mindset to financial tips, because we really do believe that supporting you as remote interpreters, supporting the whole you, right? Because it's really hard to do well when you're upset and stressed about not making rent payments or other things, right? Or you might not what it needs to be. So join our community, follow our stuff. We're here to support you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so